Hi, my name is Kimberly from the Country Bookshop, and I want to welcome y'all to this conversation between myself and Becca Rothfeld about her collection of essays, All Things Are Too Small. Becca Rothfeld is the winner of the National Books Critics Circle Nona Balkin Prize for Criticism and the Robert B. Silvers Prize for Literary Criticism. She is the nonfiction book critic for the Washington Post, an editor at The Point, a contributing editor at the Boston Review, and a PhD candidate on long hiatus at Harvard. She has written for the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the New York Times Book Review, Book Forum, the Yale Review, the Baffler, and more. She lives with her 2 dogs and husband in Washington, D.C., and it's a privilege to have you chat with us here at the Country Bookshop. The Country Bookshop, as you may or may not know, is located in Southern Pines, North Carolina, about an hour southwest of Raleigh. And we are 70 years old and are really pleased to have that kind of longevity because of our community that chooses to shop with us and support us and allows us the privilege to be a part of your lives and chat about books with you. We're a part of our community newspaper, The Pilot, which is also a media company that has different publications across the state. So Becca, thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here virtually.
Well, welcome. So the book came out just recently.
Yeah, 20 days ago, I think, April 2nd.
So that's good. That's a little bit of time for it to land and for you to have feedback. What's it been like these couple weeks when it's kind of hit the public?
I mean, I was terrified waiting for reviews because I write book reviews, and so I know how harsh they can be. But now I've gotten a bunch of good reviews. I'm very thankful for that. And so I feel relief basically. Because now even if someone writes a negative review, there's at least a bunch of positive reviews. So it's not just like universally hated by everybody, which is very relieving. And in my worst moments, I was terrified that would happen. So for a while I was like, waking up in the middle of the night, like checking like if a review was posted. And now that's kind of passed.
Were you surprised at all by what struck what struck people who are reading it and commenting on it, or was it in keeping with your intentions for how you hoped the book would be read?
I kind of was surprised by how in keeping with my intentions it was. Like I had talked to a bunch of my other writer friends before it came out about how nervous I was, and they were kind of like, you just have to let it go. Like reviewers are not really reading your book. They're kind of just projecting what they think onto the book, and it might have nothing to do with the book you wrote. So I was kind of prepared for that, and that is not really what happened. Actually, pretty much all of the reviews I feel like have really gotten what I was trying to do and were really charitable and generous and tried to see things from my perspective. So I've been happily surprised.
So can you talk about that? What was your purpose in the book or in the essays?
I mean, I guess I had a bunch of purposes, sort of different purposes in each local arguments that I wanted to make. But the global purpose of the collection is to ask about the various ways in which various parts of our society are not as opulent or luscious as they could be. And so the sort of overall thesis of the book is that we live in a society that is minimalist in a bunch of bad ways and should be maximalist in more ways than it is. Not in every way, but in the specific ways like identified in the book. So I identify various kinds of minimalism I think are bad. For example, decluttering. Obviously, you can see I'm not a proponent of decluttering. I think you should live in a house full of beloved objects and reminders of your past and loved ones. That's one example, and there are many others in the book.
It's really beautiful, a really beautiful exploration and organized very well. One of the things that struck me, just and it's just a turn of phrase, but it carries throughout the book. But you talk about the privilege of a point of view, and I was wondering if you could expand on that, on what those words mean to you. I know how you use it in the book, but it seemed so all-encompassing. I thought it was beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the sort of through lines throughout the book is that in order to be a person or a human being, you need to have encumberments and entanglements. You need to have things that belong to you, not necessarily commodities, but like heirlooms that remind you of your past. You need to have human relationships. You need to have thoughts and obsessions. Another essay in the book is about mindfulness, and that line comes from the mindfulness essay. And I read a bunch of mindfulness books and sort of determined that what a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them were saying to do is to kind of empty your mind of obsessions and empty your mind of thoughts and fixations and curiosities. And so the overall point of the book, I think, is that all of these things are what make us who we are and what make us the individuals that we are and prevent us from being kind of interchangeable. Like if you just lived in like an empty house with nothing in it and you had succeeded in emptying your mind of all your thoughts and obsessions and fixations, you would just be interchangeable with any other person. And so it's by accumulation of these kinds of things that you become who you are.
I think it's one of the things you do clearly kind of get out of the way in order to be able to make your argument, to kind of clarify within what place you are having this conversation, is to separate the political sphere and the aesthetic and emotional sphere. Can you talk about that a little bit
Yes.
more?
So I was like 6 years into a PhD in philosophy, and I left to take a job at the Washington Post. Maybe I'll go back, who knows? But I was very interested in political philosophy, and so I was very interested in various egalitarians, particularly John Rawls, who's kind of like the seminal figure in the revival of liberalism that's happened in the past like 70 years or so. And so his view is that we should be very stringent egalitarians in the political sphere, that we should apportion resources in an egalitarian way. There shouldn't be super rich people and super poor people. And we should apportion like rights and political privileges in an egalitarian fashion. Like everybody should have equal rights. It shouldn't be that some people have way more political power than other people. And I completely agree with that. But I think that because we believe that there should be egalitarianism in the political sphere, and we believe that strongly, we may have misapplied egalitarian logic in the interpersonal or in the aesthetic sphere. And the argument even goes a step further. The claim is that because we have failed to secure egalitarianism in the political sphere, because in fact, there are vast disparities in political power and there are vast disparities in economic resources and other sorts of resources, we feel powerless, and so we try to be egalitarian in the domain that we have more control over, which is the cultural domain. And so then we insist that all works of art are created equal, or that you should like love other people equally. And one of the arguments of the book is that this is misapplied egalitarianism, that although egalitarianism in the economic or political domain is an ethical imperative, in the interpersonal domain, to regard everybody equally is the death of love or friendship, both of which require that you have preferential treatment for one person that you prefer. And that we should also engage in aesthetic judgment. Like it's okay in the aesthetic domain to have hierarchies of objects. And that's in fact kind of the business of a critic, is to say that some works of art are better than others and to give reasons why that's the case. And that's appropriate in this domain.
You say love at its root is a species of prejudice, which are your words, not mine. I love how you take this kind of transference, kind of that second part of your thesis that you talked about, and weave that through it's a kind of a part of each of your points, the kind of transference that we're doing as a society, and the fact that we love crime novels and crime serialized TV shows, and what let's see, to my notes here, but the concept of socially acceptable applications of some of our appetites. Can you talk about, if I explain that okay, but can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, a lot of the book is about, I guess, sort of silly injunctions against satisfying appetites. So there are a bunch of essays about like sexual appetites, sort of in praise of satisfying sexual appetites. The serial killer. Well, thank you, Jennifer. Sorry, we are receiving a chat. If you cannot see this, if you're watching the recording, she said she can't wait to get the book, which is very kind. The serial killer essay in the book, it's not about actual serial killers. It's about like serial killer television. And it's about a different kind of appetite, an appetite for narrative. So like the argument of the essay is that detective novels, sort of formulaic detective novels of the sort that were very popular in like the mid-century, like 30s, 40s, 50s, which were often called the puzzle novel, they have really neat resolutions. They're almost like math problems or something. And there's a bunch of people who have written very good essays about this, like Edmund Wilson wrote a pretty famous one, the New Yorker critic back in the day. And so these don't satisfy our desire for stories to continue and to keep going because they end super neatly. And so the claim that I make is that serial killer narratives, they extend narrative in a way that's satisfying to us. And so they satisfy a narrative appetite. And they do this in two ways. The first is because serial killers keep killing. The serial nature of the crime is built into the narrative. But secondly, because a serial killing can never be demystified in the way that a motivated crime can be. So in these puzzle novels, you know, you have somebody who like, he wants the inheritance. And so he murders the heiress. And so that's done. The novel's over. You don't have to think about it anymore. But a serial killer presents a perennial problem because we don't understand the sort of mystery of their mind. And so this is a resolution to this hunger that we have for narrative that extends even beyond the bounds of a story. Because even when a serial killer narrative eventually does end, we still have lingering questions. And that's one of the kinds of appetites that the book praises, is this narrative appetite.
It's, as you're talking about the appetites, it seems like also the whole book is about identifying the assumptions that we have made as a society and in questioning those. So even just our relationship with different objects and the assumption that the only kind of relationship, I'm jumping to another part of the book, obviously now, but assumptions that we've made about the only type of relationships we could have with different things. Can you talk about, as you came to this book from your research for your thesis, but did you come to it already with having identified those assumptions and wanting to respond to those assumptions, or did you come to, what was your entry into these essays?
So I think that I had an intuition about the kind of cultural assumptions that I wanted to critique. And that's partially because I had written like about half of the essays before the book came together, like they had been previously published. Partially because I had to write a book proposal outlining the other essays that I would write. But I think that in general, I tend to figure out what I think in the process of writing. And so I'm never entirely sure before I sit down to do research and write exactly what I'm going to say. Because I did a lot of research for the book that I hadn't done even when I was writing the proposal. So like for there's a chapter about decluttering. It's like, it's anti-decluttering. It's in praise of clutter. And my house is a testament to my philosophy. So I read like the 20 or like whatever, 30 best-selling decluttering books, which I hadn't done before. And so I kind of was picking up on commonalities across those books. I think this is where my background as a literary critic is helpful to me because it allows me to kind of like read these texts and mine them for evidence of cultural pathologies. And so that's what I did in that chapter. Or in the mindfulness chapter, I read a ton of books about mindfulness and I kind of did the same thing. And so even though I had this not very well formulated suspicion that society was very instrumentalizing, that like all of these philosophies try to pare down human life just to what we need and to sort of get rid of all of our wants and extravagances. That suspicion was confirmed in more specific manifestations when I read the books. And I could see that, for example, the decluttering people advise you to keep what you need, not what you want. So that's sort of a thing that they say over and over. That's a mantra in these books. And so that really clarified for me this suspicion that I had that was vaguely formulated that, oh, the problem here is that they're trying to instrumentalize all of human life. And they're not appreciating gratuitous things that might not be for any particular purpose beyond pleasure.
When you talk about art and the role of art in the book, can you expand on that a little bit in conversation with us?
So my background in philosophy was in like philosophy of art and aesthetics, and that's what my dissertation would have been about. And if I ever write it, that's what it will be about. And so I love art. I'm very interested in this idea that art doesn't need to be for anything besides itself. And in that way, it's unlike other kinds of objects, particularly in contemporary life. We live in a society where we're trying to optimize everything, or where everything is supposed to be for something else. Everything is supposed to have uh, practical benefits. And even in the decluttering manuals, they can't imagine that you just have an object for no reason, that you would have an object that doesn't do anything. The only thing that it's for is existing. Its existence is its own justification. And so I think that that is something that is very unique about art in a very commodified culture where most objects are commodities that you buy or sell, or things that are supposed to increase our productivity. Art is kind of defiantly useless. And so the book celebrates different kinds of defiantly useless things. One of them is human personality, as I mentioned earlier, like these entanglements. They don't do anything for us besides making us who we are. But another gloriously useless thing is art. And so this is a kind of object that like decluttering people just can't wrap their minds around. And that's why they have crazy advice about it. Like Marie Kondo says that you should get rid of all of your books. And if you want to save the parts of the books that you like, you should cut out the sentences that you like and paste them in an album, which is, of course, not something that anyone who appreciates books as art would ever do.
As you're talking about art and you talk about beauty in the book and equating beauty to hunger, and I think it is part of what you are saying. Or before I ask a leading question, I want people to read the book and really explore and discuss the questions that your thinking brings up for them. But I'm wondering if you can talk about the beauty hunger connection and the value you give to hunger.
Yes. So I can go a little in the weeds into the history of philosophy, and you can
Please.
stop
No,
too much.
I want the weeds. I mean, because that's the joy of having a conversation with you, and please.
So
We have lots of time, so weed it out.
amazing. I'm so excited. So in my PhD in philosophy, I was reading Kant, Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher. It's actually his 300th birthday today. So happy birthday, Kant. Amazing.
I love this timing.
Exciting. So he wrote one of the most influential books like ever about aesthetics, the philosophy of beauty and art, that is still super influential. It's probably the most influential text in contemporary aesthetics, even though it was written like 300, well, I guess 250 years ago or whatever. And so I think this book is fascinating. It's really hard to read and really confusing, but I also think it is extremely wrong. And so a lot of my thinking about aesthetics has been, I've come to a lot of my conclusions via confrontation with Kant and like arguing with Kant in my head. So one of the things that Kant says that's really influential is that the aesthetic attitude is one of disinterested pleasure. What it is to judge an artwork beautiful is to have a disinterested, dispassionate relationship to it. And there's, of course, because philosophers argue about everything, there's a ton of debate about what exactly Kant means by disinterest, and some people interpret it in ways that make the thesis sound better to me, and some people interpret it in worse ways. But it's definitely been taken up by lots of people since Kant to mean that the aesthetic attitude is one of kind of chilly contemplation, and that like what is useful about art is that it helps us kind of sever ourselves from our personal attachments and commitments, and we have an impersonal relationship to it. And so I just think that this is completely wrong. I think that actually our attitude towards art is one of desire. And so I draw on another thinker in the book, Simone Weil, she's a very curious figure. She was a French Jewish philosopher, but she had a sharp turn towards Catholic mysticism, and she ultimately starved herself to death. So one of the essays in the book is about her, but she has this very beautiful essay about beauty where she talks about how we want to eat beauty. And a lot of our attitude towards beauty is we want to consume it, or it invokes an appetite in us that we don't know how to satisfy. And this to me seems very true of our experience of beauty for lots of reasons. Like when you see a piece of beauty, it awakens in you a desire to possess the beauty. It also awakens in you a desire for more beauty. And her claim as a Catholic mystic is that this appetite that you have when you look at beautiful objects is really for heaven or for something that's more than the earth can provide. Even though I'm not a Catholic, much less a Catholic mystic, I think the kind of structure of what she's saying really resonates with me. This idea that art is an intimation of a world that is fuller than our own. And it allows us access to more than our own life could ever provide. And that is why it invokes this craving in us. And that's also a theme throughout the book is this desire for more than we could ever have, or this desire for more than one life could ever provide. And art allows us access to more lives than our own.
One of the things kind of in keeping with that, and I was taking side notes listening to you, so give me a second to get there. But one of another assumption that you really address is the assumption that the present is better than our imaginations and our thinking. And can you talk about, and you outline it in great detail in the book, what you're addressing. Well, can you just talk to that, please?
Yes. I mean, I think that this is one of the reasons why art invokes these enormous appetites. It's just that we're kind of reacting against the intrinsic smallness of life. I mean, I think the book is an argument against, well, the book criticizes all these needless smallnesses that are present in our culture, like this exhortation to minimize things in your house and to minimize thoughts in your mind and to sort of minimize your sexual appetites. But the book also recognizes that there is a more fundamental, ineliminable smallness just baked into human nature. And this is that our lives are finite. Like we die eventually, we only have one life. And so I think that our best escape from that, a kind of revolt against human finitude, is represented by various kinds of imaginings, various kinds of artworks, not just, I guess the book considers actual artworks, like there's a lot of essays that are about films that I like or novels that I like, but also about like the fantasy of like sexual encounter and other kinds of fantasy that allow us to kind of expand beyond the bounds of our life.
I find it, I love that. I think your book, there's some other books that are essays, quite actually, and thinking that's coming out now, really giving weight to our imagination and trying to give words to this. And I think it's a really interesting movement and thought that's like peaking just the first 4 months of this year into publishing. And one of the things that I really think makes your collection of essays outstanding is the way that the argumentative nature of it is, that it takes this point of our society and really addresses what it means in the larger sense. And I thank you such a great deal for that. But one of the things that you talk about when you're addressing our sex and the physicality and the metamorphosis that's possible through that. Can you talk a little bit about that, specifically in the willingness to assume risk in that kind of juncture of what you're talking about? If you could speak to that a little bit.
So one of the essays in the collection is about falling in love with my husband, and I think he's still a little uncomfortable that I wrote it, but I think he's forgiven me. And so it's about how desire and sex transform us. And in part, it's an essay about the films of the director David Cronenberg, who's a Canadian director who pioneered the genre called body horror. So a lot of his movies are really disgusting, and they feature really disgusting transformations of people into monsters or aliens and so on. So the film that I focus on is called The Fly, and it's about this man who he's a scientist who accidentally fuses his genetics with those of a fly, and he slowly transforms into this giant, disgusting human fly hybrid. But I read the film metaphorically, and I say that this is kind of what desire and falling in love can do to us, like a really intense erotic encounter can sort of transform your body, and can transform your desires and can transform you into a different kind of person. And so I draw on the work of a philosopher named L.A. Paul. She's a philosopher at Yale who has a book called Transformative Experience, in which she's talking about how you can decide whether to embark on a transformative experience and whether there's any rational way to do so. And she basically concludes that no, there isn't really, because you don't know, not only do you not know what it will be like when you've transformed, but you don't know how the transformation will change your values. In traditional decision theory, the way that you decide how to do something or to abstain from doing it is by assigning an expected value to the thing. But in the case of a personal transformation, that's not possible because your own values might change so dramatically that you might no longer value what you did before. So she kind of concludes that the only way that you can decide whether to engage in an activity that's likely to transform you is to decide in favor of risk, to decide in favor of renewal. And because that's kind of all that you can know at the outset. And she has a lot of examples that aren't just an erotic encounter. Like one of her examples, a fanciful example, but a kind of helpful one is, imagine that you are in a society where all your friends and family have decided to become vampires, and you have to decide whether you're going to become a vampire. Is there any rational way to do that? And she's like, no, you can just, what you can decide is whether you have a preference for the unexpected and the unpredictable, and then see what happens, or you can decide to sort of remain as you are. And so I say that a similar kind of thing happens in an erotic encounter. There's always a risk that you are going to fall in love and be transformed. And that's the whole point of having an erotic encounter or falling in love. If it left you exactly the same, there would be no point in engaging with other people. We want them to change us. And that's what makes these encounters valuable. But at the same time, that exposes us to risk because we can't know beforehand how we'll transform. And so we have to be willing to accept that risk. And so in this essay, I say that, of course, consent is important in a sexual encounter, but what consent can secure is not total security, because that is not possible if you're having a real exchange with somebody else where you're truly vulnerable to them because they could transform you in an unexpected way.
And I think before you go into the argument along the erotic encounters that you talk about, you bring up far more traditional or commonplace ways people become a vampire that people might be more familiar with or even more comfortable about chatting with, to understand, to have this a similar kind of conversation where marriage or pregnancy or different things, kind of applying the same kind of thinking versus experiencing and transformative encounters to that as well.
Yeah, pregnancy is another example in L.A. Paul's book. And then another one that's really interesting, although probably not super commonplace, is like deaf people who need to decide whether to get this particular kind of implant that allows them to hear. And there's a lot of discussion about that in the deaf community, I think, because some people really identify with having to use sign language, and there's like a whole like deaf culture and so on. And so like by deciding to have this implant, you're deciding to kind of have access to a whole range of sensory experiences that you've never experienced, and to kind of like leave this community. And of course, you don't know in advance like what that would be like. So that's the other example that she uses.
It's really interesting. Can you talk about the cover of your book, how it came to be, and specifically what it is, and your thoughts about it?
Yes. So I was so happy. I mean, you hear lots of horror stories in publishing of people who get these covers that they don't really like, that their publishers make them have because they think it will sell more books. And that is not what happened to me at all. They listened to me totally. I was like, I want a Bosch cover. And they were like, okay. And so they gave me a Bosch cover. This is exactly what I wanted. So it's the painting called The Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch, who is a medieval sort of religious painter. And it's a
triptych, right?
Yes, it is a triptych in person. It's really big. I've seen it in person. It's like huge. And the cover is only a sliver of it. Actually, I'm very bad at graphic design kind of thing. So they provided me with an even better way of putting it on the cover than I could have imagined, because the cover is kind of this insanity bursting through. I was just like, just put the whole picture on the cover.
This is better. This can, I mean, you're right. There are some covers that are, I think, a masterclass of taking a book and putting it in a singular image. And it's been a while since I've encountered one that deserve, like the famous one, the dry memoir that's dry, and the word dry is dripping. I feel like this cover goes in that category of brilliance.
Yeah, I love it so much. So yeah, it's a scene of like sort of like earthly bacchanalia that of course like Bosch means to condemn, because he's painting from a medieval religious perspective. But the book, of course, is a celebration of earthly excesses, and kind of a call to inhabit the garden of earthly delights. And so that's why I chose it. There's also a writer who I really like, named Norman Rush, and all of his covers have images from Bosch on them. They're not like the whole painting. They'll take one figure in the painting and kind of blow it up. And so I kind of wanted to subtly reference Norman Rush as well, because one of the essays in the book is about one of his novels.
One of the things that I came to the book curious about, um, but that's not necessarily what the book is, but is about the how religion, our modern day culture, the religious culture in our modern day experience affects our passions and our excesses and the drive to live in a certain way. And that's not necessarily one of your essays, but I was wondering, you know, was that just not a part of your book pitch? Is that not where your thinking has gone specifically, or are these just kind of supporting essay that, or is that just a different part of the conversation that
Yeah,
you
that's a
didn't
good
want to
question.
express, or that I was just curious about that.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of people have asked me, like on the tour circuit and such, about religious stuff, because even though the book is not explicitly religious, there's clearly a lot of religious thinking or kind of religious sensibility in the book. So I think the reason I didn't tackle religion explicitly is because I'm just not very religious and I'm not a scholar of religion. So I feel like there's just a lot of things about religion in America that I don't know. I'm kind of loosely, informally, culturally Jewish, but so I don't know a lot about evangelicalism, for example, which I feel like is something that if you were talking about excess and religion in America, you would want to kind of explore the charismatic movement, which is maybe one of the most obviously excessive movements in American religion. And so I just don't feel like I know enough about that, even though I'm very interested in it. But I do think the book touches on religion in America in a number of like oblique ways. One of the ways is kind of by reference to the aesthetics of Puritanism. Like one of the essays discusses, it's the essay about decluttering, but there's a part of it that's kind of about the traditional American preference for simplicity and plain speaking. It quotes from an essay by William Gass, who's a philosopher and literary critic and novelist, who kind of remarks on this American fetishization of simplicity that he dates back to the Puritans. And then in one of my essays about sex, I kind of talk about this group of people who are not explicitly religious in their motivation. Some of them are actually, but many of them are not. But I call them the New Puritans, this group of people who critique the sexual revolution kind of in favor of an older spate of sexual norms. And then there's lots of like medieval mystics who show up in the book. I guess medieval and subsequent, because Simone Weil is not medieval. She's like a post-war mystic. But yeah, there's like Catherine of Siena. The title comes from a medieval mystic named Hedwig of Brabant, who writes this poem about how basically life on earth is too small, and so she needs to overflow into the heavens. And so there's a lot of religious thinking that's quoted in the book. I have a particular affinity for medieval mysticism, I suppose.
Yeah,
But
which is interesting because medieval mystics can only exist in that moment of time where religion is so specific, which is interesting. You referencing that. I think one of the beautiful things for many book clubs or many people who choose to take a look at this book is the fact that that since it's not specifically on religion, there's so much more opportunity for further discussion within different religious communities or people who affiliate with different ways of worship. And I think it's almost an opportunity, not anything else, just because it allows the conversation to be disseminated in a lot more spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely like sort of consonant with religious impulses. Like it's very sympathetic to like the hunger for more than our life can provide. And I guess my sort of solution to the limitations of human life is art and its imagining of a richer world. But I'm not hostile to religious solutions to
Not at
that
all.
problem. Yeah.
No, I think it's an invitation for it. I think it's an
Yeah,
invitation
precisely.
for discussion. I think that is part of what makes um the book so beautiful, and the weaving of the book so interesting. I have several other questions of my own, but since we do have several people here with us live, if any of you who are, I want to extend the opportunity for y'all to ask questions in the chat since you are here. But I was wondering if you could discuss when you talk about love, the concept of love as waiting, and that it is only from a woman. And I it struck me since we had just gone and you had just taken us on a deep dive through someone who loves Marie Kondo. It was like I was like, that woman doesn't wait, that woman controls. That's a different kind of love. And I was wondering if you could address my confusion there, or it's not a great question, but if you could talk to the small pieces that I've given you there and
Yes,
get
totally.
whatever you want.
No, I think that is a good question because I think it picks up on a consonance between those two essays, which is basically like many parts of the essay collection are kind of celebrations of like a loss of control, particularly one that's occasioned by an encounter with another person. So the transformation essay is one of them. There's another essay about waiting and love, in which the kind of claim is that being in love with somebody makes your existence dependent on somebody else's existence. So it means that you kind of feel halved or truncated when the person is not available to you. But that is not, it's not necessarily a bad thing, even though of course it can be an uncomfortable feeling because that's the cost of transformation. And similarly, I think that the critique of decluttering is a critique of this idea that you should be in absolute control over all of your spaces. I think one line in the book is about how it's actually profitable to kind of stumble over things in your house, to remember memories because they have a physical presence in your house, things that you might not want to remember, but that it might be good for you to remember. But when you have total control over a space or total control over your life, there's no possibility for transformation because you can't be taken by surprise by something outside of you, whether that be an artwork, a family heirloom, or another person. So I think that that's the point of continuity between those essays. And
It's interesting as you're explaining it in this way. It strikes me as the difference between shopping for a book online, where you have total control, you think you know exactly what you want, and you go get that, versus coming into, for example, the country bookshop, where, and I love how you called it, it's profitable to stumble on things, and you mean for I mean, but I think that is the beauty of being in a physical retail space, where, and that spherical experience where you might not know, you think you're looking for one thing, but just by virtue of walking through the different sections of books, you don't know, you actually may stumble upon something else. And I think that it's interesting that this is part of what you're trying to explain in your essays, because it's something I find myself constantly speaking about when talking about the retail sphere and this moment in time of the messiness of in-person real life versus the controlled cleanliness sterility of online. And I'm wondering if you could take all your thinking and apply it to that for a hot second, just to hear where you might take that connection.
I think that's totally right. I mean, one thing that I kind of noted is when I was reading these decluttering books, the pages look like the homepage of an iPhone or something. Like they have lots of boxes as if it were apps. And I feel like that's also kind of the vision for like your physical space, is it's kind of this like clean, neat lines, mid-century modern kind of digital look. And maybe that is the fantasy, is having as much control over your physical space as you have over your digital spaces. But I think you're totally right that this is one benefit of going to a physical bookstore, which of course I love to do. And that's why I have so many books, is that you might not know what you want, or you might think you know what you want, and your desires will be transformed by an encounter with a book that you hadn't expected to find. And like so many of my best reading experiences have come from just stumbling on a book in a bookstore that I'd never heard of before. And that intrigued me. And that can start like whole obsessions.
How do you take that and stumble it? We're in the period where now we're just talking there. And if anyone wants to jump, has a specific question about the book, who's here, please take it in. But how would you take that into people? There's a point in your essays where you're talking about the waiting, and you talk about today's digital dating. But I also think about the in-person experiences in retail and in a way of living, which is truly where my daily thinking is all the time. And it comes into physically taking the risk of running into people, taking the risk of what that encounter would be. Can you talk a little bit about, my question is like, could you write an essay about the bookstore, and could you write an essay about the running into people? Because being the benefit of all your thinking is a privilege, which is why I love this All Things Are Too Small. And I think everyone should read it and talk about it and take it to places of your thinking. But
yeah, I think that the arguments I make apply to a lot more things than I sort of specifically apply them to. But I definitely think that going to a bookstore is one and dating is another. I mean, I don't think I talk about Tinder specifically, except to mention that these like sexual reactionaries really don't like it. But I kind of agree in some ways, not with their critique, but with other critiques of Tinder or other critiques of online dating apps, which for precisely this reason, that you might think that you know what you want in another person, but if human experience serves to teach us anything, it's that you can constantly be surprised by your capacity to love people that you wouldn't have imagined that you could love. And they can change you into a kind of person with different preferences and values who can love that kind of person. And so if you have absolute control over the process, you're never going to be vulnerable to being changed. Another avenue where I think you could apply this is to a discussion of pornography, which I kind of touch on like a little bit in the book. I mentioned that if you go into like an encounter with another person with a rigid fantasy and impose it on the other person, you're not appropriately sensitive to changes that they might incite. But I think that could be applied sort of specifically to pornography for kind of the same reasons that it can apply to online dating. That if you just have total control over the experience that you have, that's kind of not what I think sex is for. Sex is for allowing somebody else to surprise you, and that's not something that can happen when you have total control over the experience.
yeah, to run into each other, and if you have total control, you don't allow the ability to imagine, because you can't like bump into something bigger that affects you.
And it's kind of like just being like by yourself. It's kind of just being by yourself in kind of an expanded sphere, because like the point of interacting with other people is they're not you. They say things that you would never have thought to say. But if you have total control, or like I was actually something you could even apply it to, which is so weird. I went down this insane wormhole the other day reading about AI generated girlfriends, which is apparently a thing that's happening, which is horrifying. Like there's all these websites where you can go to the website and like put in what you want your online girlfriend to look like, and it will generate like a robot for you. And that's kind of, it seems to me that that's kind of like the logical extension of the logic of Tinder or the logic of pornography. Is like you just create a person who does exactly what you want, who doesn't surprise you or challenge you in any way, who doesn't change you because they're just the product of like your own pre-existent desires made manifest. And that seems like horrible.
But I think that's in part of the underlying value of ultimately what you're arguing through these specific essays, is that there is a that our society does not and should place a high value on the idea that there's more than one way of being. And here are the reasons why it's important to accept kind of that pluralism. I don't know about that, but what do you think about that?
I think that's definitely true too. And I think I touch on this a little bit in the beginning of the book where I talk about liberalism. So I talk about John Rawls, as I mentioned him earlier, and how he thinks that we should be really stringent egalitarians about the economic and political organization of society. But the reason why he thinks that is not because he thinks that that would allow us to then be rigidly egalitarian in our personal lives. It's because he wants pluralism to flourish. And he thinks that a society can best be pluralistic if the society itself doesn't privilege any one way of being and allows people to just have the resources to realize whatever way of being they prefer. And so like the point of this stringent economic and political egalitarianism is kind of disproportion and chaos at the interpersonal level. And so I think the book is a celebration of that. And that's one of the things that I kind of love about liberalism as a political philosophy is its embrace of diversity and chaos and clashes between like different kinds of people. It doesn't try to impose uniformity. And I think that that's great.
I agree, but I thought it was very interesting where you, this is on page 8 of my advanced reader edition, but you talk about, you take that a little further when you take it to the cultural side and where we might have confused that. I'm reading you, this is the access, the equal access versus the equal, and this might be a nice way to end, because I feel like this is very much the point of your book, and we've gone full circle. But could you end maybe with that distinction of liberalism as a wonderful overarching acceptance of everything and democratization of access to the judgment side of culture, full
Yeah,
circle?
so this is the distinction that like political philosophers would call the difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. So one way of sort of putting my thoughts is that I think that there should be equality of access to economic resources, to wealth, to esteem, to political power, to education. But I don't think that that ensures or should ensure equality of outcome, by which I mean that like even if we all have equal access to education and resources, we're not all going to be equally good at dancing or making sculptures. And it's okay. And it would be more okay in a society that was egalitarian in these other ways, in which even if you're bad at something, that's okay because you're guaranteed to have the resources to be able to survive. It's still okay to sort of discriminate in the aesthetic sphere, or it's still okay even if everyone has equal access. If you just fall in love with one person, you don't fall in love with everybody. You don't think everyone is equally worthy because you have a preference for one person. That seems natural. And I think that this is not unlike what Rawls envisioned, where you have an egalitarian political society, but then at the level, what that facilitates is just like insanity at the level of interpersonal exchange. And that's how it should be.
Well, Becca, I want to thank you so much for all your thinking and for bringing it together in this phenomenal collection of essays. All things are too small. I want to thank everybody who's here with us live or listening later, or in sharing this with your friends or book clubs or neighbors. And I want to encourage all of us to take a look at this and to have conversations that I think are interesting. And I just want to remind everybody, conversations are far more interesting when not everyone agrees. And I think one of the beautiful things about this collection of essays is that is an opportunity to have far more interesting conversations in your book clubs and gatherings than I think many people. I mean, it's a treat. It's a joy to have a conversation that might allow you to think a little bit differently than you have in the past. So thank you. Oh, and you should all get your books at the Country Bookshop.
Of course. Yes.
Of course, yes, yes. Don't let me forget about that. But Becca, thank you so much for your time and your thinking and your writing. And I know we all will look out for your reviews and your articles, but also to see what you come up with next as you return to your thinking about art, which I look forward to see what you come up with. So
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation. Bye,
thanks.
guys.